So again, I think when you speak about religious Zionism, it really has to start at the start of the Zionist movement and the role that the religious Zionists played. So basically, when Zionism started, so it was really starting as a movement primarily by secular Jews, and primarily they really started as a break from traditional Judaism, a certain rejection even of traditional Judaism, and where it had taken the Jewish people to be a people that couldn't stand up for themselves and was just all kinds of anti-Semitism all around the world, and part of that was the Jew not being able to stand up for themselves, and so therefore, and part of where that developed from was from this religious mentality, and so therefore there was a need to start this Zionist movement, but not only a Zionist movement to create a new Jewish state, but a Zionist movement also that looked to really cut from traditional Judaism and to start a new Judaism with really the nation as the center of it. Because of that, most religious Jews at the time therefore rejected this movement because it was totally against everything that they stood for. Meaning, in a certain sense, obviously, religious Jews believed in the Jewish nation, and at the Seder over here we said, "Shana B'Av Yerushalayim," and we believed in a certain theoretical sense about coming back to Israel. But at the same time, and so in that sense it's positive, at the same time, again, it's a complete rejection of our faith and tradition, and that's really the core of everything that we are. So how can we participate in such a movement? And that's the stand that most religious Jews took. The minority, really, of religious Jews at the time was the religious Zionist movement that took a look at this Zionist movement, certainly did not agree with the entire platform of the Zionist movement, as we still felt that Torah was the center of everything that we do and all our beliefs, but at the same time believed that there was a lot of positive in this movement, both in a very practical sense that we believe that it's a good thing to have a Jewish state, just for the security of the Jewish people, and that there's a home for us, and from a very pragmatic level, but also from a religious level, we very much feel that is what Judaism was supposed to be, a Jewish nation, and that's what's described all through Tanakh, and that was classically what Judaism was supposed to be. Unfortunately, we went into exile, and so for many years we lost the opportunity to really exist as a nation. But now that there's a movement to recreate that, so we very much see it as a positive religious step as well, and that we can now fulfill Judaism in its broadest sense. And so because of that, we joined as full partners in the Zionist endeavor, even though we did not agree with a lot of the platforms and perspectives on religion and Judaism, but because we felt that there was great significance in this movement, so we joined as full partners in this movement. As far as some of the implications of that, and I would say even some of the accomplishments, I would say that there's kind of two sides of it. On the one hand, so we really were able to bring a lot of religious Jews into this, and so therefore we certainly, very practical level, help the Zionist movement, help the creation of the State of Israel, help the continued existence of the State of Israel, just as participants, as Zionist participants in this movement, just as everyone else did. But number two also, and this is certainly a very big focus of us, we brought in a tremendous amount of Jewish religion and culture and values into this society, and so that exists, on all kinds of levels. That exists. Number one, that we were able to create, large religious Zionist communities in Israel with their own educational systems, with yeshivot, with its own political party, with its own religious movement, and you probably all take that for granted that exists today, but that was certainly, if religious Jews did not decide to take part in that, so those things would not have existed in our society today. So that's number one. And number two, again, we were able to bring in, on the national level, on all kinds of level, for example, Tanakh is taught in all the schools. There's all kinds of things where Judaism was brought into the society. El Al does not, El Al, the official airline of Israel, does not fly on Shabbat. There's other airlines, people, that fly on Shabbat. The official airlines of Israel do not fly on Shabbat. We were very involved in education throughout the years, because also that's really where we felt our primary goal was. For the first, really the first 20, 25 years of the state, we were basically in every government, and primarily, what we always held was the Ministry of Education, because that's where we felt, our focus needed to be, to really bring up a, nation of people with Jewish values, with, Jewish continuity. And, and you see the fruits of the labor today, and you see, all the different aspects of army, government, society. Again, you have, religious Jews everywhere you are. And, again, that's a tremendous, tremendous accomplishment. And, unfortunately, to really have a future for the Jewish state, there certainly needs to be a religious core value, because at the end of the day, it's very hard to, keep up that ideology, the Zionist ideology, without a base in Torah and without a base in religion. And so, because of that, so at the beginning, so there's a tremendous amount of ideology in the state. And, in later years, so it led to post-Zionism. I don't know, how familiar people are with that, but, certain doubting of certain, Zionist stands. And nowadays you have hundreds of thousands of Israelis who have left Israel, who, live in America today. Probably many of the communities you come from have a tremendous number of Israelis there. And, and so, we very much feel that that the Torah ideology, needs to be at the center of this endeavor. We don't, not necessarily in a coercive kind of way, but we certainly believe in educating and impacting, the society, to join in those beliefs. There is a big discrepancy between how we view Greater Israel in this, religious Zionist movement. Again, the more pragmatic side of the movement, which I do believe is the minority today, is far more open to land for peace kind of agreement. If I remember correctly, when I read the book 6 Days of War, I don't know if people here have read it, but so at the time when the cabinet voted on whether or not to conquer the old city during the 6-Day War, the religious Zionist movement, which is represented by Mafdal at the time, so they actually at the time voted against the conquering of the old city because they were very nervous about the political fallout and on the international stage, and so they actually voted against it because, again, it's a much more pragmatic view. Ideally we do hope that this is a part of a messianic movement, but in the short term we believe in a much more pragmatic kind of view about building this state.
Labor Zionism arose as an answer to the Jewish question, right? Which is this question about what will we do with the Jewish people? The essential existential query about what happens with the Jews, mainly of Europe in the middle of the 19th century. Obviously the question goes back longer than that, but that's when all these ideologies of nationalism and different carving up, the empires are beginning to crumble, the European empires are crumbling, and there's going to be a new political makeup of the continent. What happens with the Jews, who have no natural sort of nation or political boundaries in this continent? Some of the answers that came up were something which led to Reform Judaism, which said that we'll fit Judaism into this paradigm that will fit with all the other European communities, and the Beit Knesset, the synagogue, will just be the Jewish church. There'll be the Protestant church and the Catholic church and all these different churches, and the Jewish church, and that will be, I'm simplifying, yeah, but go with me. That was Reform Judaism. We'll be fully German, fully French, fully American. Jewish is the thing that we do on the weekends. Then there was also the potential for assimilation. We'll stop being Jewish. We'll completely assimilate culturally in every other aspect with the communities where we live. There were a few other answers, but those are two of the key ones. And Labor and Zionism came out as a separate answer to that. That said, Judaism firstly is more than just a religion, and so primarily rejecting the reform answer. But there are things deep inside Judaism, deep universal human moral values that are worth keeping, and our ancient national identity is something that's worth preserving and has some sort of place in the world and place in the lives of Jews today, and is something that's not only worth preserving but worth regenerating, worth breathing new life into and keeping alive and allowing it to be creative and to grow and to evolve. And that's where this concept of national revival comes in. And national revival is not something that can happen on someone else's soil. We need to return to our homeland, to the place where we were born as a nation, spiritually, religiously, culturally, where the first inkling, even though it wasn't called, nationalism didn't exist back then, but what we can today interpret as a national identity was born in this land. Let's take the Jewish people, return them there, and not only are we going to return there and transplant the kind of European society as we see it around us today, in 1850, 1860, but we're going to create an ideal society. We're going to see everything around us that we reject, that's bad, feudalism, rigid social classes, economic exploitation of the weaker classes. We're going to take all of those things and we're not going to allow them to exist in our society. They're evil. We've seen what they do, not just to Jews, but to the weaker populations of Europe. Those are bad things for humanity. They're not going to exist in our new society. And we're going to look into the good values that we can see arising in these emerging ideologies in Europe today, like things from socialism and nationalism, ideas of equality, of egalitarianism, of emancipation. And we are going to also look for the values deep inside Judaism, values like Shivyon Erech Adam, and the ancient Jewish traditions which have kept our people today and provide us meaning in our lives today and have a message for the world, not just for Jews. And we are going to build a society in this image. And that was essentially the vision of Labour Zionism. You know about the aliyot, the first, second, third aliyot? Yeah, kind of, more or less. Well, the people who came in, let's say the second aliyah, were products of this movement, and they came here with a vision of building egalitarian communities and eventually leading to a federation of semi-autonomous, liberal, progressive, Jewish, equal communities. What eventually manifested in things like kibbutzim and moshavim, which you've probably spent some time on. Yeah, they're nice. And in so doing, also create all the agriculture and industry which would make this a viable nation, a viable state rather. I should point out that state was not the initial dream of what a state, or the state of Israel with a flag and an anthem and national emblems, was not the ends of this Zionist vision, but became a political necessity, and I would say was some sort of tool or a vehicle for the national revival of the Jewish people. I think personally that it remains a political necessity to this day, but there are people on the left who disagree. And I think that's an important attitude switch to make when trying to understand the origins of Zionism and also the mission of Zionism today. The state is not the ends, it's a vehicle for something. The questions that we're left with are, what is it a vehicle for? What are we aiming towards? So just to sum up what the major pillars of Labour Zionism were and are today, I use the Hebrew words for them because, Hebrew is the national language of the Jewish people and a cornerstone of the revival of Judaism. So we'll say shituf, which means sharing, essentially, collectivism. Shivyon and Shivyon Erech Adam, equality, the equal value of the human spirit, regardless of what kind of Jew you are or whether you're a Jew or not. Chalutziut, which is this idea of pioneering, of building something new, of not just wallowing in the past and entrenching ourselves in tradition, but establishing a new world. And Hagshama, which I think is something that... is that a familiar term?
Actualization.
Yeah, actualization. Not just... A belief isn't just something that you have and don't do. It's not something that sits in a book in your library, so when visitors come to your home, you can say, that's what I am, that's the belief system that I fit into. It's something that you do. It's something that transforms the world. That's Hagshama. And I think these are the pillars of socialist or Labour Zionism. And just to give you an idea of the people who came here and what they founded, the people who came here in that vision founded such organizations, some of which you might be familiar with, some less. The Gdudei Avodah, Solel Boneh, the Histadrut, the Labour Trade Federation Union, Kupat Cholim, Klalit, the Eged Bus Cooperative, which is kind of the cooperative still, but less. The Hapoel Sporting Clubs, the Haganah, the defense organization. All the essentially democratic, egalitarian institutions which went on to be the major building blocks of the state. One by one, successive governments have tried to rip them apart limb from limb, with some success and in other cases less success. But those are the things that they built, the things that went on to become the state and central pillars of what you recognize of the state today.
My grandfather was Zev Jabotinsky's personal secretary, so we have like a family history and I'm familiar with it. I'm not like a college professor level expert on the subject, but I do know a lot, and I'll try to bequeath to you what I know. I'd like to start with the Q&A, but me to you. Just tell me who said the quotes that I'm going to say. In Basel, I created the Jewish state.
Herzl.
Herzl, yeah. But now I'm going to get to some harder ones. We have no program for a Jewish state. Another one, I have no sympathy for a Jewish majority in Palestine. And the last one I'll give you, a Jewish majority in Palestine is not our maximum, but our minimum demand. Okay, so in order, there was Herzl, then we had David Ben-Gurion saying we have no program for a Jewish state in Palestine. Then we have Weizmann saying I have no sympathy for a Jewish majority in Palestine. And then we had Zev Jabotinsky saying that a Jewish majority is our minimum. And as Gabe alluded to, there are people on the left today who still believe that Jewish statehood is not really so essential. And that was also a debate that was going on almost 100 years ago. The way you're kind of taught Zionism today is that, well, there was Ben-Gurion and there was Weizmann, and everybody wanted a Jewish state, and they just kind of did the best they could at trying to promote that goal until eventually it was established. And we had to suffer through the Holocaust, but we eventually established the Jewish state. And usually an add-on to that is we only got the Jewish state because the Holocaust created all this world sympathy for Jews, and therefore the UN gave us the Jewish state. The truth, at least according to my narrative, I keep saying that, but I think the actual truth is that that wasn't the situation. There was a big debate about whether a Jewish statehood was the goal. I think for some people, it was something that that was the goal. Like for instance, at the first Zionist Congress, the Congress resolved, Herzl was openly for a Jewish state, but the Congress resolved that the goal of Zionism is a publicly recognized, or a home for the Jewish people in Palestine secured by public law. It might be off a drop on the quotes. And that was already seen as a compromise, saying we can't really talk about Jewish state because it's so controversial and so out there. Let's dumb it down and call it a home. And you also see in the Balfour Declaration that Her Majesty's government favors a national home for the Jewish people. So the word, already at the beginning, the word state was kind of not used all the time. And there were a lot of people, so for some people that was something, okay, it's a sacrifice we have to make. And for other people, no, that is a kind of crazy thing. We have to really start focusing on a national revival, a cultural home. There was Achad Ha'am, there was another guy called Martin Buber, and then the first president of Hebrew University, Judah Magnis, and they all said, we don't really need a state, we need a national home, a cultural center, have the best people come here and develop the culture and have a national revival, but not necessarily a state. And Jabotinsky, or Herzl, in my view, was really the first revisionist Zionist, and Gabe said that Zionism is really not. What did you say about statehood? That labor Zionism was the original Zionism. Another difference between a revisionist Zionist and a labor Zionist or a socialist Zionist would be that Zionism is the true Zionism, and Herzl Zionism, or another way that we would call it, would be political Zionism. That we're talking about statehood and political control of the country. Sometimes you hear right-wingers now talk about sovereignty as an alternative term. But Jabotinsky kind of saw that Weizmann was kind of diverging from the goal of Jewish statehood after World War I, and a number of disagreements took place between him and Weizmann, and eventually Jabotinsky at the time was serving on the board of the on the Zionist executive. He eventually quit and formed an organization called the Revisionist Zionist Movement. It was actually called the League of Revisionist Zionists. And they resolved that the goal of Zionism was to establish a Jewish majority on both sides of the Jordan River. At the time, Palestine was both what's today Israel and Transjordan. And from there, that was the kind of key disagreement. And from that stemmed a lot of things. In the 1920s, there were a number of anti-Jewish riots. And Jabotinsky's reaction to these riots was to have a Haganah. It wasn't actually established by the labor movement. It was established by Jabotinsky and Pinchas Rutenberg, and they established that. That was one of the core disagreements. Is anybody familiar with Jabotinsky? Yeah, I thought it was getting better that he was being mentioned more in high school Zionist classes. If you have,
He's mentioned, but
but it's like an aside.
I don't know his story.
Monkey-looking guy with glasses. He was a Russian journalist, I guess I would say, a Russian writer, and he had become somewhat well known like Herzl, I guess, in the Western world, in the Eastern or Russian world. Jabotinsky was a very well known writer. He was considered to be the next Dostoevsky, perhaps, or somebody greater, or somebody in his own right. And he was converted to the Zionist movement when he saw the Kishinev pogrom. And according to him, he went there on a mission for a newspaper to collect charity, to distribute charity. And according to him, he saw a piece of Torah parchment on the floor, and the lines that were, the words that were there, it said Be'eretz Nochriya. And he kind of came to like the Herzl-Dreyfus conclusion right there, that we need to be in our own, we need to have our own state in our own homeland, and we need to defend ourselves. And he went on from there to establish multiple, or to help set up multiple self-defense groups throughout Russia. And when World War I broke out, at that point he was already working for the Zionist movement in Turkey. He came to the conclusion, like a few other radicals like Weizmann at the time, that the only side, that the side that Zionism has to take is the side of the Allies. Because only then will Turkey be broken up, or the Ottoman Empire be broken up, and the Jews can have a state. And the thing that he did that went a step further than, let's say, Weizmann, was that he said, we need to have a Jewish army that's going to fight in the war. A, because it's going to increase our claim. If the Jewish army fights at all, anywhere, we're going to have a place at the peace table. B, if it fights in Palestine, we're going to have greater claims to Palestine. And C, we need to revive the Jewish national military tradition, because that's part of, that you need to defend yourself, but also that's part of having a state. Every state has a military. And he went on lobbying the British government. First they established what was called the Zion Mule Corps, which fought in Gallipoli, but not as really, it was a transport unit, not as really an army. And then later he went to London, where he lobbied and eventually the British agreed to set up Jewish army divisions. And that was called the Jewish Legion in English. Here it's called the Gdud HaIvri. And that became Jabotinsky's big claim to fame. And because of that, he was essentially recruited to the Zionist executive, where he lobbied when Arab riots against Jews broke out in the early 1920s. He lobbied for the creation of a Jewish defense organization, what was called the Haganah. Later, it did come under labor control and was dominated by the labor movement. But over time, there were disputes between Jabotinsky and the rest of the Zionist movement over, A, what are our goals? Are we allowed to have a Jewish defense organization? The Zionist movement said, no, it has to be something you keep quiet. He said, no, it has to be open, because our goal is a Jewish state, and a Jewish state has a Jewish police force and a Jewish army. The third major point of discord was Aliyah, whether it could be restricted at all. And the British restricted Aliyah on the basis of absorptive capacity of the country, which the revisionists and Jabotinsky people saw as a kind of mask for appeasing Arab demands. The British internally were saying, well, if we lose Arab support, it's going to be very problematic if we have to fight Arabs everywhere in the Middle East. And Weizmann kind of accepted, and they put forward this absorptive capacity argument, and Weizmann kind of accepted it and said, yes, it's true, we have to be moderate, we can't say that we have that we're trying to take over the country, we can limit Jewish immigration on these kind of terms. And as the 1930s went on, this became a bigger and bigger point of discord, and eventually the revisionist Zionist movement split off from the Zionist movement in 1935. And basically from then on, what they did was the revisionists trained Jews to fight, to be soldiers, and they brought them into Palestine illegally. And that was the original, people you hear about Aliyah Bet and how the Haganah brought these people in, but initially it was a revisionist Zionists, and they were doing it against the Zionist movement, which was trying to hurt their fundraising efforts, and it was against British restrictions.
I think historically, most revolutionary Zionists don't like the term Zionism and don't identify by the term Zionism because And it's a semantic question, because they view, or some view, Zionism as a 19th century European nationalist movement, and that has nothing to do with us. We regard ourselves as an indigenous people that was displaced, and we want to correct the justice perpetrated against us by the Romans, and that really has very little to do with 19th century European nationalism. So, among those who do self-identify as Zionists, who will use the term Zionist to define themselves, they would define Zionism as the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, which was essentially born when the Roman Empire invaded our country, destroyed our temple, uprooted us from our soil, and exiled us from our land. Meaning that according to the revolutionary Zionists who will use the term Zionist to self-identify, Zionism was born on Tisha B'Av. Right? And this also has roots just in Midrashic literature. It says the Mashiach is born on Tisha B'Av. Right now, if you believe that the Mashiach is some magical hero who's going to come and appear one day and save us from all our problems, then this wouldn't make sense. But if you believe that the Messianic movement is a collective movement, that it's something that we are all supposed to participate in equally, then you could say that that movement of Jewish liberation began the moment we lost everything we're fighting for. Meaning the moment the Romans came and destroyed everything that we had, destroyed our civilization, destroyed our temple, destroyed our way of life, smashed our national framework, sold us into slavery, forced us into exile, then began the movement to correct that injustice. Another distinguishing characteristic of revolutionary Zionism is that while most Zionist streams, I would say that the religious Zionism, not the religious Zionism of Kook, but definitely the religious Zionism represented by Rabbi Katz, also perhaps the labor or socialist Zionism represented by Gabe and Daniel's revisionist Zionism, all of these Zionisms are viewed by the revolutionary Zionists as viewing the Jewish people as an object with a problem. That problem could be persecution, that problem could be assimilation, that problem could be homelessness, statelessness, anti-Semitism, and Zionism is the solution to the problem, right? And there are other solutions, meaning socialism was a rival solution, and I think the labor Zionist movement tried very hard to synthesize the two. Whereas the revolutionary Zionists, they view the Jewish people as a subject with desires. Meaning that even if we could live happily ever after in Lithuania or Los Angeles with yeshivot and kosher restaurants and security and not have to worry about anything, parnasah, everything is provided, we would still be willing to give all of that up and even our lives in order to see Hebrew independence in Jerusalem. Because for us, the goal of Jewish history has become restoring that which we lost, that which the Romans took from us, right? Correcting the injustice that was perpetrated against us, and that is something worth fighting for and dying for. Because the revolutionary Zionists, for the most part, self-identify as Semitic and not Western, self-identify as Middle Eastern and not as being part of the West, they view the other indigenous peoples of the Middle East, not only the Arabs, not only the Palestinian Arabs and the Arabs in other countries, but also the Kurds and also the Maronites and also other minorities in the region as our natural allies. So these are the people we desire unity with. Not just peace, not just what we had with Egypt for 30 years where we don't fire guns at them and they don't fire guns at us, but actual Semitic unity. That we actually want to create a bloc. We want to create a bloc in the Middle East that, and during the Cold War it was spoken, revolutionary Zionists wanted the Middle East as a collective to remain neutral, not take a side, not be in the Soviet camp and not be in the American camp. And although not all revolutionary Zionists were officially Marxists, they did develop a very Marxist, or maybe I should say a very Leninist analysis of British imperial interests in the Middle East, what the British were doing here, and therefore decided that there is a necessary conflict between the Jewish people in the minds of revolutionary Zionists being the natives of this land, and the British Empire who was occupying our land. You know, within the revolutionary Zionist circles, you had a lot of Yemenite Jews and Jews from other parts of the Middle East, but you also had a lot of Ashkenazim, obviously, and the Ashkenazim self-identify, even though they had personally come from places like Poland or Russia or other parts of Europe, they personally all identified as Middle Eastern, as Semitic, and believed that they were only ever in Russia or in Poland or in Germany as a result of a crime committed against them, but they're not Germans, they're not Russians, they're not Lithuanians, they're Semites, they're Hebrews, they're from the Middle East, and they're no less Middle Eastern, no less Semitic than a Jew from Mesopotamia or Egypt or Yemen. So again, like I was saying, although they're not all Marxists, they did develop a very Marxist approach to combating British imperialism. They were the first to declare the British the enemy, and they worked to not only fight the British themselves, but to create a conflict between the larger Jewish community, who was not behind them, and the British Empire. And a lot of their political work, and a lot of their extra-political work, we could say, because a lot of the revolutionary Zionists found expression in the Lehi movement, in the Stern Group, in the pre-state Jewish underground. They worked very hard not just to fight the British themselves, but everything they did, essentially every bullet they fired, every proclamation they made, every bomb that went off was geared towards widening the conflict between the British and the Jewish people. And by coincidence, I think the labor Zionists, I know Gabe mentioned Solal Boneh and the Kibbutzim and the Haganah, the groups who did consider themselves to be socialists were actually acting as collaborators with the British for the most part. So Solal Boneh and the Kibbutzim had a lot of economic interests in the British occupation continuing. The Haganah actually hunted Jewish freedom fighters from Lehi and later the Etzel, who I guess we'll talk about later, and hunted them and handed them over to the British. So while the self-defined socialist Zionists were actually collaborating with British imperialism, the revolutionary Zionists and even many of the revisionist Zionists, ironically, were fighting British imperialism. Like the socialist Zionists, however, the revolutionary Zionists do not look at the state of Israel as the goal of Zionism, but rather as a tool with which to achieve a greater goal. And I think we have to define what that goal is, what the Jewish people have wanted for thousands of years. And I would argue that the revolutionary Zionists are the one group responsible, just like I would say Eliezer ben Yehuda can be attributed responsibility for reviving the Hebrew language. I would say the revolutionary Zionists are responsible for forcing the British to leave, not expelling the British, forcing the British to leave. I make a distinction. And we would not have independence today if not for that struggle for independence against the British Empire.